Hello and welcome back to the Crime Reel. Today's case split a police force and the general public as to whether it was a case at all. Was it a murder, or did she take her own life? Having spent considerable time researching the details of this case, I find it hard to believe that this was ever even questioned. Saturday, 18th of April 1987, Easter Saturday. It was a beautiful sunny day. Around 5 that afternoon, a woman was out walking her dog near Taplow Lake in Maidenhead. She saw what she thought was a body in the shallow water at the edge of the lake. The woman ran to the main road and flagged down a van with 2 men inside. The 3 people returned to the lake and saw a woman's body face down in the water. Her hands were tied behind her back and her feet were tied together. They waded in and walked over to the body, pulling it to the edge of the lake. The body was already stiff and it was clear that the woman was dead. She had also been gagged. The police were called and within a matter of minutes the first officers had arrived. The body was soon identified as belonging to 26-year-old Shani Warren. Shani was a secretary who lived in a house share with 2 other women on Neville Close in Stoke Poges, Buckinghamshire. She was extremely close with her parents and spoke to her mother every day. Her mother described their relationship as being like best friends. Shani also had 2 brothers, Stephen and Jeffrey. The previous day she had visited her father at about 10 a.m. to borrow an extension lead so that she could cut her front lawn grass. A neighbour saw her doing this on the afternoon of the 17th of April and recalls seeing Shani load a black sack of grass cuttings into the boot of her car before heading out. Her parents lived in a home with a large garden, and it was usual for Shani to take her grass cuttings to their house to add to their bonfire. At around 6 o'clock that evening, Shani's father, 57-year-old Joe, noticed that his daughter still hadn't arrived, and Elsie, who was Shani's mother, remembered saying that their daughter had probably gone out with friends as it was a lovely sunny evening, and no doubt they would see her the following day. However, the following day would bring the devastating news that their daughter's body had been dragged from a lake in Taplow, which was about 8 miles away. As the body and surrounding area was investigated and photographed, a number of facts and, at times, seemingly contradictory information came to light. Shani's black Vauxhall Cavalier was parked in a lay-by next to the lake. This lay-by was alongside the A4, a very busy road with lots of passing traffic. Those close to Shani could think of no reason why her car would have been parked in this area. If there had been some kind of altercation, this would surely have been witnessed by someone on such a busy road. All of the car doors were locked with the exception of the driver's door, which was slightly ajar. The driver's seat was fully reclined. In the footwell of the car there was an Easter egg. Nearby the police found a bag which had contained a tow rope, and it was concluded that Shani had been gagged and bound with items from her own vehicle. A forensic examination of the car was clear. There was no blood nor signs of a struggle in her vehicle. In the area where Shani's body was found, the police found multiple small indentations in the mud which were consistent with the stiletto shoes that Shani had been wearing at the time. However, there were no other footprints, making it appear that Shani had walked by herself to the lake edge. A search of the lake found a jump lead which appeared to be tied in a noose. Shani's hands had been tied with the second jump lead from the set. The police also found a card addressed to Sir Roger. As the light began to fade that evening, the pathologist arrived at the scene. Dr. Benjamin Davis was a very experienced Home Office pathologist who was briefed on the scene and photographs. He looked across the lake and commented that it looked as though Shani had done it to herself. At the post-mortem, Benjamin examined Shani's body for the first time. There was a gag around her mouth that had been tied with a simple single knot. Her feet had been bound with the car tow rope, and her hands had been tied behind her back with the red jump lead. Because of the stiff nature of the jump lead cable, these makeshift handcuffs were relatively loose, to the point where Shani could have slipped her hands free. There was no sign of sexual assault, and Shani had been fully clothed when she was found. She had been wearing very tight jeans, which would have been nigh on impossible to put back on to her post-mortem. She had a perfect manicure that had not been damaged in any way, and also had no defence injuries on her body. There were no drugs or alcohol in her system. Shani had water in her lungs, so had been alive when she went into the lake. Her cause of death was drowning. Taking all this into account, the Home Office pathologist concluded that she had neither been sexually assaulted nor murdered. His belief was that Shani had ended her own life. People close to the case were divided. Did Shani die by her own hand or at the hands of a monster? If it was a murder, why were there no signs of violence or a struggle? Why were there only one set of footprints? And how did she get through the barbed wire and mesh fence that surrounded the lake? But then again, is it reasonable to assume that she ended her own life? She did not leave a note for anyone, not even her family, who she was very close to. And Shani had never demonstrated any signs of depression. And why would she tie herself up and gag herself before taking her own life? Even the incident room was split into two opposing opinions of what exactly they were investigating. Initially, the newspapers all ran with headlines talking of murder, including the headline, "Bound and gagged Shani, 26, hurled to death. Horror of Lake Tomb Girl. Gruesome and apparently motiveless crime. Bound, gagged and hurled into a lake. Nightmare of girl left to drown by her killer." However, it was soon reported that detectives were not ruling out the possibility that Shani had taken her own life, with papers stating that the case was mystifying the police and that it was baffling to detectives because there were no signs that Shani put up a struggle, no other injuries, and no evidence of sexual assault. Shani's brother Stephen was angry at the suggestion, stating, "That's just ridiculous. How can they suggest that she tied her own hands behind her back, put a gag in her mouth, tied her ankles together, and jumped into the lake? She was not depressed, and she had everything to live for." Until they could be sure either way, the police investigation continued. They interviewed her family, friends, ex-boyfriends and colleagues. A friend and work colleague said that Shani had been excited for the long Easter weekend and had plans to buy Easter eggs, complete some chores, go out with friends, and then go to the family's holiday flat in Bournemouth with her parents. The pair had made plans to catch up the following Tuesday. It was established that Shani had gone out for dinner on the 16th of April to an Indian restaurant with an ex-boyfriend, Roger Pell. Whenever they had visited this restaurant, the staff had referred to him as Sir Roger, the person who the police found a card addressed to at the crime scene. Roger had found out about Shani's death from the front page of the newspaper and immediately got in contact with the police to tell them what he knew. He was interviewed at length on multiple occasions, but ruled out of having any involvement. The police tried to establish whether Shani could have tied herself up. A female police officer tried to replicate the way in which Shani had been tied and found it impossible without the help of another person. Shani's family did not believe that she would have taken her own life. She was happy, looking ahead in life, and had everything to live for. Her mother stated how, although Shani could swim, she could not bear having her face in water. There was no way that she believed that Shani would have done that to herself. The case featured on the BBC TV programme Crimewatch, which led to a possible lead where someone had seen a black car broken down on the A4 on the Maidenhead side of Taplow Lake. 3 men and a woman had been standing around it. Shani's car was examined and a fault was found with the gearbox. Had she broken down and then been attacked? The police, through contact with the AA breakdown service, discovered that this car belonged to a different woman and had no bearing on the case. In the Crimewatch appeal, they revealed that Shani's brown leather purse and car keys with a Scotland keyring were missing. These have never been found. The appeal also led to some possible additional sightings. A woman said that she had been parked in the lay-by at Taplow Lake at around 6:30 p.m. on Good Friday, where she had seen a green car and a woman who may have been Shani talking with a man. A man had also contacted the programme to say that he was in the area on the evening in question and saw a man standing by the lake at around 7 p.m. Nearby was a dark green car, possibly a BMW. He described the man as being between 30 and 40, with dark receding hair, middle-aged spread, and wearing a suit. In May 1987, there was a new twist in the case. A 33-year-old man by the name of Charles had ended his own life and left a note in which he directly accused another man of causing Shani's death. In early June, a photo fit of a man who the police wanted to speak to was released to the press. This man had been seen from 10 p.m. to closing time at the Old Station Inn in Taplow, the night before Shani's body was found. He was around 23 to 26 years old, wearing a beige bomber jacket and dark or beige trousers and possibly white trainers. These leads were all fully investigated and one by one were ruled out of the inquiry. In June 1987, the South Buckinghamshire coroner, John Roberts, said that Shani's body could be released for burial. Her funeral was held on the 15th of June 1987 at St James Church, Gerrards Cross in Buckinghamshire. The case dragged on with little progress. One officer described it as like working in the dark. Meanwhile, the rumours of Shani taking her own life continued to create still more pain for the family, who desperately needed privacy, but instead found the insensitivity of the press and certain police extremely distressing. 6 months after Shani's death, an inquest was held to determine how she had died. Her family, along with the national media, were present. A knot expert was called into court to demonstrate whether or not it would have been possible for Shani to tie the knots binding her hands and feet herself. He demonstrated with his hands in front of him, and when it was pointed out that Shani's hands were behind her back, he simply removed one hand and then placed it back through the loop behind his back due to the loose nature of the bindings. He spent 10 minutes replicating the bonds unaided, which led him to the conclusion that Shani could have assembled them by herself, but there was no evidence that she had actually done so. Dr. Benjamin Davis, the pathologist, was also present and was almost smug in his firm belief that Shani had ended her own life, stating that it was obviously done by Miss Warren herself and that the knot expert agreed with him. Despite the knot expert stating that it was only a possibility, Benjamin went on to add that the knots were so amateurish he could not imagine an assailant tying her up in this particular way. His theory was that Shani had bound her own hands and feet, applied a gag to her mouth before lying down in just 18 inches of water to drown. The ligature mark on her neck indicated that she had tried to strangle herself before drowning. Benjamin referenced 3 other cases that he had worked on where people had attempted to strangle themselves and applied a gag before drowning in the bath. A leading psychiatrist, Dr. John Hamilton, also provided evidence at the inquest. He had been asked to examine more than 7 years' worth of Shani's secret diaries and found no evidence that would point to Shani being depressed. He said that he could find no reason to think she would have done it in such a bizarre and complicated way, adding that he had never encountered somebody who had gagged themselves and tied their hands and legs together before ending their life. It was also extremely rare for someone to fake a homicide in this situation. The coroner ruled that neither argument had been proved and as such returned an open verdict. Whilst the case remained open, with no further leads and dispute over the existence of a crime, Shani's death was no longer actively investigated by the police. The incident room was closed, with one member of Thames Valley Police stating that there is not a shred of evidence to even suggest that she was murdered, and also stating that because Shani had a disproportionate level of fear of catching AIDS relative to her lifestyle, and had also sworn off of men at that time, that they believed that these two pieces of information add heavily to the theory that she had taken her own life. Her family remained convinced that she had been murdered, and a neighbour offered a £10,000 reward for any information that led to finding Shani's killer. Unfortunately, despite the reward offer, this led nowhere. It would be another 10 years before there was any more progress on the case. In December 1997, the police had discovered striking similarities between Shani's death and a series of violent sexual attacks on women in Leicestershire, Yorkshire and Nottinghamshire. Operation Lynx was tasked with tracking down the man responsible for these attacks and resulted in the biggest search since the Yorkshire Ripper. The offender was an extremely dangerous, violent, psychopathic sexual predator, and it was clear that he had the potential to commit extreme violence and potentially murder. All of his victims had the same MO. They were lone women who were abducted in their own vehicles and driven to a secluded location where they were sexually assaulted inside their vehicle. Afterwards, they were allowed to get dressed and were taken to a location where there was water, tied up and pushed into that water. The similarities to Shani's death were striking. In March 1998, Operation Lynx made a breakthrough. One of the victims had told the police that her attacker had picked up an envelope from which the police were able to obtain a partial fingerprint. At the time, this partial print could not be searched against the whole database by computer, so the search had to be completed manually. A geographic profiler had already stated that the offender most likely lived in Leeds, so to narrow the search down, the police compiled a list of men who had attended Leeds Magistrates' Courts for 6 months either side of the first known offence in 1982. They eliminated anybody who didn't fit the physical description of the offender, a white male in his 30s or 40s, and quickly arrived at a positive match for the partial fingerprint. Clive Barwell was arrested, and DNA testing proved that the 4 attacks in Leeds, Bradford and Nottingham were all linked to him. The work to prove his involvement in Shani's death continued. A timeline of Clive's life was developed. The lay-by where Shani's car was found was heavily used by lorry drivers, couriers and truckers. Clive was a courier at the time of Shani's death. On Good Friday 1987, Clive was working between Swindon in Wiltshire and Heathrow Airport. He had deliveries to make in Maidenhead town centre, which is only a mile away from Taplow. After 10 years, the police were convinced that they had caught the person responsible for Shani's death. When questioned, he replied, "No comment," and had no reaction whatsoever when he was showed photographs of Shani. When his case went to trial in 1999, Clive pleaded guilty to 3 sexual assaults, 1 attempted murder, and 4 kidnappings at Teesside Crown Court. However, there was no forensic link between him and Shani, and despite detectives believing that he was responsible for Shani's murder, no charges were brought against him for this crime. Once again, there was still no justice for Shani. It would take another 21 years for this to change. By 2020, new techniques had been developed which could be used to reinvestigate serious cold cases, and Shani's case was revisited. The team working on this had no doubt that she had been murdered. Since 1987, the evidence from the scene had been kept in sealed packaging to avoid contamination, including the jump leads, tow rope and mouth gag, together with tapings from Shani's clothes when they had been examined 33 years earlier. Testing on the gag showed the presence of Shani's blood. There was also sperm present, which yielded a male DNA profile and proved sexual assault. From the tapings taken from Shani's bra, a partial male DNA profile could also be produced. This was hopefully everything that the police needed to charge Clive with Shani's murder. They were shocked when the DNA was not a match. Instead, this pointed them to another man, 66-year-old Donald Robertson, someone who had never featured in the investigation at all. Donald had a horrendous criminal record, showing that he had been a huge danger to young women for decades. He was convicted of multiple different sexual assaults, and during the 20-year period from his first offence to his last, he was only out of prison for around 4 years, always reoffending within months of his release. By the time the DNA in Shani's murder came to light, Donald was already incarcerated at Little Hay Prison for a different offence. During the police interview, Donald replied no comment to every question about Shani. As the police delved further into Donald's life, they found that he had been arrested on suspicion of sexual assault of a 16-year-old girl in Slough in 1981. At the time, he denied any involvement, and the young girl had to endure an identity parade to pick out her attacker. The rules at the time, which have thankfully now changed, meant that she had to identify her attacker within his presence and hearing. Traumatised by this event, she said nothing and only identified Donald when she was outside of the room. This made the identification inadmissible and no charges were brought against him at the time. Fortunately, the physical evidence in this case had also been preserved. Donald's DNA was found in the victim's underwear. The police joined this sexual assault case with the charges of murder and sexual assault of Shani. The case went before Reading Crown Court in April 2022, where the jury was told that the sperm on the gag was 1 billion times more likely to be from Donald than not, and the DNA on the bra tapings was 27 million times more likely to be from him than not. Donald did not bother to attend the trial. The evidence was clear, but the police and prosecutors were still concerned that the wildly incorrect judgment of the pathologist, Dr. Benjamin Davis, from years before could come back to haunt them yet again. They needn't have worried. The verdict was unanimous. Donald was found guilty and sentenced to a minimum term of 30 years. Then 66 years old, it is hopeful that he will never see the outside of a prison again. Shani's brother Stephen described his sister as warm and caring and said their parents, who had died the previous year, had never recovered from her death. He went on to say that it is one of life's tragedies that everything can be destroyed in an instant. Somehow or other, Shani encountered Donald Robertson, whose practice was to attack unaccompanied young girls and women, terrifying them into submission with vicious threats and abuse. We cannot imagine what the last moments of Shani's life must have been like, but you may agree that no punishment is enough for her attacker, a psychopath and a coward who lacked the courage to attend court or even give evidence via a live link. That concludes today's case about Shani Warren. Please subscribe if you're new to the channel, and unfortunately I've run out of time again this week, so hopefully there'll be petty crime next week, hopefully. Thanks very much for listening to the Crime Reel. Stay safe. Goodbye. Psst. Today's case was from Maidenhead, which is famous for the biggest railway bridge in Europe. It was built by Brunel. Some speculated it had a design flaw and it would collapse once a train went over it, but as it was built in 1838, I guess the critics were wrong. Goodbye.